At exactly noon on October 22nd, 2025, sunlight poured across the western Pacific. The sea looked almost unreal, smooth as glass, stretching in every direction in a vast field of blue. But inside the watch floors of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, a quiet alert began to sound. Fresh high-resolution satellite images had revealed two massive wakes moving steadily eastward, far beyond the routes normally associated with Chinese naval patrols. The tracks were broad, deliberate, and heavy, the unmistakable mark of aircraft carriers. Within minutes, analysts confirmed what they were seeing: CV-16 Liaoning and CV-17 Shandong, China's two active carriers, sailing together beyond the so-called Second Island Chain, the invisible boundary that for decades had defined the outer edge of American maritime dominance in the Pacific. What made the sighting remarkable was not only where they were, but how they were moving. The two carriers were operating side by side, their escort ships spread around them in a near-perfect formation. At 12:18 p.m., radar operators aboard the USS Halsey, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer patrolling about 200 nautical miles east of the Chinese formation, detected the same contacts. The ship's SPY-1D phased array radar produced clear, symmetrical returns. The group was making 18 knots, heading almost exactly east. No transponder signals, no radio calls, no change in course. Every detail about the formation suggested discipline, planning, and complete radio silence. On the bridge of the Halsey, the watch officer called it out. A new contact group bearing 271, range 195 nautical miles, likely in planned formation, with multiple high-value returns. The captain, a veteran of Pacific deployments, remained calm. He gave a simple order: confirm classification, maintain shadow distance, and log every emission. This was no ordinary tracking operation. It was a front-row view of a major naval moment. High above the scene, U.S. Navy P-8, a Poseidon patrol aircraft, circled overhead, their synthetic aperture radar scanning the ocean below. The live feed made the picture even clearer. Two carriers, each escorted by Type 055 cruisers and Type 052D destroyers, with supply ships following closely behind. One look at the satellite overlay was enough to understand the message. This was not a routine exercise. It was a carefully arranged display, a signal from Beijing to Washington, written in steel, formation lines, and white wake across open water. We can operate here too. At 12:37 p.m., the Halsey's electronic warfare console picked up faint pulses, narrow-band radar sweeps from a Chinese cruiser. They were not aggressive enough to trigger immediate concern, but they were firm enough to make their presence known. The captain responded with measured restraint. Record it. Stay passive. They're probing for our signature. Don't hand it to them. Farther south, the USS John Finn, another Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, adjusted course to hold a parallel track. Between the two American ships lay nearly 100 miles of open ocean, a silent buffer between two rival fleets now moving through the same waters. The Americans understood their mission: observe, document, and avoid escalation. The Chinese understood theirs just as clearly: test limits without crossing the line. At 12:50 p.m., both carrier flight decks came alive. Satellite imagery showed J-15 fighters launching in synchronized pairs, twin plumes of exhaust flashing under the midday sun. Deck crews moved with precise coordination. Aircraft were armed and refueled. Helicopters lifted off for anti-submarine patrols. Over open channels, Chinese state media described the activity as routine blue water training. But the location told a much more powerful story. These carriers were now east of the Philippines, in waters long associated with regular U.S. naval presence. Inside the Halsey's Combat Information Center, the room glowed in dim green and blue light. Operators spoke in low voices, updating coordinates, while the SLQ-32 system captured every pulse coming from the Chinese radar arrays. One petty officer reported multiple frequency sweeps consistent with fire control search. The captain studied the display and answered quietly. They're tracking us, not locking us. Keep it steady. Above deck, sailors stood along the railings, watching a faint smear of smoke on the horizon. To the naked eye, the scene looked calm, almost beautiful. Distant ships moving through a bright and peaceful sea. But everyone aboard understood the tension beneath that calm surface. One bad read, one misunderstood signal, one mistake over the radio, and a high-stakes standoff could shift in an instant. Then, at exactly 12:58 p.m., another alert arrived from the National Reconnaissance Office. A third, larger radar contact had just departed port in Fujian Province. Its signature matched a ship the world had been waiting to see at sea. CV-18 Fujian, China's newest and most advanced carrier, equipped with electromagnetic catapults. Its sea trials were beginning. The timing was anything but accidental. As Liaoning and Shandong pushed farther east, Fujian moved out behind them, turning what had already been a striking two-carrier display into something even more consequential, a three-carrier message. By 1 p.m., the picture had fully taken shape. Two carrier strike groups were already operating beyond the second island chain, a third carrier was preparing to enter the scene, and the United States was watching it all unfold with the growing realization that the strategic balance in the Pacific was shifting in real time. There were no exchanges, no dramatic confrontations, no urgent warnings over the radio, only the steady hum of radar systems, the deep pulse of engines, and the unmistakable sense that a long-standing boundary had just been crossed. The Pacific, once seen as America's uncontested arena, suddenly felt tighter, busier, and far less predictable. And as the captain of the Halsey studied the radar scope glowing in the midday light, he spoke the thought few wanted to say out loud. They were no longer training only for defense. By 12:35 p.m., the calm surface of the Western Pacific had turned into a silent chessboard. From orbit, satellites traced two clean crescents of white wake as Liaoning and Shandong advanced eastward in disciplined formation. Around them moved nearly a dozen escorts, Type 055 cruisers, Type 052D destroyers, and a cluster of fast replenishment ships holding steady pace. Each vessel emitted just enough electromagnetic activity to make its presence known, but not enough to reveal too much. To experienced American observers, that kind of restraint was no accident. Aboard the USS Halsey, the Combat Information Center pulsed with low-controlled tension. Radar screens glowed with green arcs as operators tracked every movement. One of them reported multiple aircraft airborne on Vector 105 at Angels 12, likely another Combat Air Patrol rotation. The captain answered in the same measured tone, "Mark it and continue passive tracking." The order carried the familiar meaning known on every U.S. destroyer in contested waters: see everything, provoke nothing. High above, a P-8A Poseidon reconnaissance aircraft moved through a wide, patient orbit, its sensors sweeping across hundreds of miles of open sea. The live feed relayed back to the Halsey showed fighter patterns taking shape above both carriers. J-15S climbed in mirrored formations, cycling every 30 minutes and maintaining overlapping patrol zones. Analysts watching the feed noted the consistency and precision. This was not theater for the cameras. It looked far more like a rehearsal in sustained naval reach. At 12:48 p.m., the first real moment of friction appeared. A Type 055 cruiser, hull number 102, broke slightly from formation and began drifting toward the Halsey's bearing. It was not openly hostile, but its heading was unmistakably direct. Inside CIC, a junior officer called out the new track and reported a closest point of approach at 3.4 nautical miles, still decreasing. The captain's expression hardened, but his response stayed controlled. Flash the warning lights only, no radio. A moment later, the Halsey's signal lamp blinked across the water. International waters, maintain safe distance. Through binoculars, sailors on deck strained to spot any reaction. There was none. The Chinese cruiser kept its bow pointed forward and continued closing. Inside CIC, the returns on radar began to draw closer together. The gap dropped to 2 nautical miles, uncomfortably close in a situation already heavy with tension. Someone quietly noted that the cruiser appeared to be crossing their path. The captain remained still. "Hold course," he said. "Let them turn first." Then, at 12:53 p.m., the Type 055 reduced speed sharply, cutting its pace in half. The closing vector dissolved. Instead of pressing in, the cruiser settled abeam and matched the Halsey at a controlled distance. It was a textbook signal of deterrence, a warning without escalation. The meaning came through clearly. We see you, and we are comfortable coming close. By 1 p.m., the pressure extended into the air. A pair of J-15 fighters dropped from altitude and swept low across the horizon. Their vapor trails flashed like silver lines in the midday light. They carried no immediate sign of offensive intent, but they passed close enough for the Halsey's optical systems to capture insignia on their tail fins. The electronic warfare officer reported that the aircraft were scanning the ship with radar. There was no lock, but they were actively painting the deck. The captain let out a slow breath and gave the order to log everything and save the waveform. Every emission, every sweep across the spectrum was valuable intelligence. The Halsey's SLQ-32 system captured the fighter's radar signatures in real time, data that would later be analyzed in depth at Pearl Harbor and folded into threat libraries for years to come. Farther south, the USS John Finn reported similar activity. Chinese destroyers were making overlapping turns nearby, and the pattern looked coordinated. Piece by piece, the wider picture was becoming impossible to ignore. This was not a random encounter on open water. It was a controlled display of presence, coordination, and confidence, carried out in a part of the Pacific where such a display would once have been almost unthinkable. They're working on flanking patterns. The observation came quietly, but everyone understood what it meant. The response from the U.S. side was just as controlled. The USS John Finn adjusted course by 12 degrees to starboard, mirroring the movement while keeping a lawful distance. No signals, no escalation, just careful synchronization. At 1:12 p.m., the situation tightened. The Halsey's radar detected a sudden spike, a high-energy beam coming from a Type 052D destroyer within the Chinese formation. It wasn't a targeting lock, but it was close enough to trigger the ship's electronic support measures. A sharp alert tone cut through the CIC. For 3 long seconds, no one moved. Then the signal vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The captain spoke calmly. "Stand down." That was intentional. They're checking how fast we react. Between the two fleets, the silence held. No radio calls, no warnings, just the deep hum of engines and the steady rhythm of radar sweeps. On the surface, the ocean remained calm. Below, it was anything but. Sonar operators aboard the Halsey picked up distant propeller signatures, likely Type 093 attack submarines running deep, forming a hidden perimeter around the carriers. Every sound was recorded, every vibration captured and streamed for later analysis. At 1:25 p.m., the situation shifted again. The P-8A Poseidon's infrared sensors detected bright flashes, missile launches from one of the Chinese destroyers. The projectiles arced eastward over open water and detonated far from any target. A controlled demonstration. Still, each launch carried weight far beyond the horizon. On deck, sailors watched thin trails rise into the sky. One of them quietly compared it to fireworks. The captain didn't react the same way. Those launches had purpose. By 1:30 p.m., Chinese state television began broadcasting footage of the drills. Fighters launching with afterburners blazing, missiles streaking across clear skies, warships firing in coordinated sequences. The narration framed it as a display of strength and readiness, a navy extending its reach beyond familiar boundaries. Inside the Halsey, the tone was very different. No commentary, no reactions, just data. Radar tracks, signal patterns, flight intervals, missile paths, everything recorded with precision. This wasn't just a show, it was a full demonstration of capability. For decades, China's naval operations had largely remained close to its shores. That reality was changing. By midday on October 22nd, 2025, the shift was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding in real time. Watching the horizon, the Halsey's captain put it simply, they're preparing for what comes next. By 2 p.m., the tension began to ease, at least on the surface. Liaoning and Shandong continued forward, their wakes stretching across the calm water. But the live fire activity had stopped. Smoke from earlier launches drifted away, leaving only faint heat haze rising above the decks. For nearly 3 hours, 2 carrier groups had carried out a highly coordinated operation. The message had been delivered clearly. Inside the Halsey's CIC, the pace shifted from tracking to analysis. Operators reviewed massive volumes of collected data, radar frequencies, missile telemetry, launch cycles, and aircraft operations. The captain watched the numbers scroll across the screen, arms folded. "We just saw how they operate," he said quietly. "Now we figure out what it means." The next development was already underway. At 2:18 p.m., new satellite data confirmed movement from Fujian province. A large vessel had left port, heading southeast. It was CV-18 Fujian, China's most advanced carrier, beginning full-power sea trials. The timing was precise. While Liaoning and Shandong operated far out at sea, Fujian was stepping into the picture from home waters, signaling the next phase of capability. Unlike earlier carriers, Fujian was designed with electromagnetic catapult systems, similar in concept to those used on the U.S. Navy's newest carriers. This allowed it to launch heavier aircraft, including advanced fighters and early warning platforms, significantly expanding its operational range and flexibility. For years, analysts had debated when China's Navy would fully transition into a force capable of sustained operations far from its shores. Watching the events unfold that day, the answer was beginning to take shape in real time. On October 22nd, 2025, that question finally had its answer, recorded in the databanks of 2 American destroyers, tracking the scene from a distance. By 2:30 p.m., the USS John Finn reported that emissions from the Chinese formation were beginning to drop. Liaoning and Shandong started easing into gradual turns back to the west, a slow and deliberate withdrawal. The operation had run its course. The signal had been delivered. Even so, the American crews understood a simple truth of naval strategy. A force pulling back is often preparing for the next time it moves forward. Before standing down from heightened readiness, the captain of the Halsey ordered one final entry into the log. Chinese carrier groups had conducted coordinated operations east of the second island chain. The strategic importance was high. Their conduct had been steady, disciplined, and sustained. From there, the information would move quickly, from the destroyers to 7th Fleet, from 7th Fleet to Indo-Pacific Command, and from there to the Pentagon. Within hours, teams of analysts would be combing through every detail, comparing radar signatures, measuring launch cycles, mapping movement patterns, and testing what those figures might mean for the future balance of power in the Pacific. For the United States, the takeaway was difficult but clear. The Pacific could no longer be viewed as an uncontested space. The real shift was not defined by damage or confrontation, but by confidence. The confidence of a Navy that now appeared willing to operate wherever the U.S. Navy had long moved without question. And perhaps that was Beijing's deeper objective all along. Not to force a direct clash, but to make its presence feel routine. To make Chinese carriers seem as normal in the Central Pacific as American ones. The diplomatic reaction came quickly. Tokyo described the exercise as a destabilizing show of force. Canberra called it a strategic provocation. Manila saw it as proof that geography alone no longer guarantees security. Even Seoul, usually cautious in public messaging, issued a rare statement urging restraint. Across the Indo-Pacific, the message had landed, and no one misunderstood where it came from. By later afternoon, the Halsey's radar showed the Chinese formation shrinking toward the outer edge of the screen. Contact by contact, the returns faded until they disappeared beyond the curve of the Earth. Then, there was only distance again. The captain stepped onto the bridge wing, sunlight still flashing across the water. Around him, the crew loosened only slightly. No one truly relaxed. One petty officer broke the silence and said they would return. The captain gave a small nod. Of course they would. The ocean remembers every challenge. Far above, satellites continued tracking Fujian as it accelerated to the southeast, throwing white foam into its wake, a reminder that the next time China pushed farther east, it might not be with 2 carriers, but with 3. For 70 years, the United States Navy had set the rhythm of the Pacific. Its presence shaped the region, and its reach was rarely questioned. But as the Halsey's sensors fell quiet, and the horizon returned to open blue, one reality settled over the crew with unmistakable weight. Deterrence is no longer about distance alone. It is about resolve. The Pacific had just become smaller, narrower, and far more crowded. So the real question remains, was Beijing simply making its presence known, or preparing the ground for something much bigger? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this breakdown held your attention, follow the channel for more cinematic, fact-driven stories from the world's most closely watched waters. Because at high noon on October 22nd, 2025, the rules of the Pacific did not change with noise or spectacle, but with a wake drawn boldly across open water.